Today we're going to be beginning a two-part series where we're going to seek to answer this question: who is Satan? Even those who do not know or believe the Bible have heard of Satan. They recognize this as the devil, the enemy of God, one who is evil. And when we preach from the Bible, we do lessons from the Bible, we like to talk about God, we like to talk about Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, and we need to talk about them. That's important. But we also need to understand who Satan is. Satan is a real being. He is not a myth. He's not merely the personification of evil. We need to know who this being is. So in this lesson and the next one, we're going to be looking at some of the things that the Bible teaches us about Satan, his origin, the way he is described to us, the limits of Satan, his work, and also the future of Satan. Now, in preparing this lesson, I do want to mention that I did take advantage of some information that was compiled by Wayne Jackson in his article, Satan, Everything You've Always Wanted to Know But Were Afraid to Ask. That is available on his website. You can search for that title in his name and you should be able to find it. But a lot of the information I found, I took advantage of the research that he did in compiling this, because really there's just a lot of information in the scriptures to go through. And so in this lesson and the next one, what we're going to be doing is try to condense a lot of that and just give an overview on this topic so we can understand or be reminded about who Satan is. We're going to begin by looking at Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9, because in this verse, the reason why we're starting here is because it describes or uses several different terms to describe Satan. And in Revelation 12 and verse 9, it says, "The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." So here we have a description described as the devil. He's called the devil. The name is Satan, the serpent of old, which refers back to Genesis chapter 3, which we will talk about. This is the being that we are talking about here in our lesson today. So what is it that we need to know about Satan? The first thing we want to talk about here today is the origin of Satan. Where did he come from? Satan, we need to understand, is a real being. He's described this way throughout the Bible. He's not talked about, or Satan, this concept, is not talked about just as a myth or just the personification of evil, that we understand what evil is, and so we have to put something tangible in its place to describe evil. No, this is a real being. We have over in Job chapter 1, Satan described there as actually having a conversation with God. In Job 1, 6 through 8, says, "There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' Then Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? For there's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil.'" Now, a lot of times we might look at those verses there, and we use those to talk about Job and to introduce a lesson about that godly man and his character. But what we see there about Satan is that he was a real being. He was having this conversation with God. He was just as real as God is. In Matthew chapter 4, we have Satan with Jesus, tempting him. He was just as real as Jesus was. Same type of descriptions. They have a conversation with one another, just as God was having a conversation with Satan back in Job chapter 1. Satan is a real being. He's not a myth. He's not the personification of evil. He is a real being. And he's a real being who would have been created in the beginning. Over in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 16, Paul was talking about the role of Christ in creation. And he says there that for by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So we have Jesus being instrumental in creation. So if everything was created and every power that exists is under him, it was created by him, that would include the devil. That would include Satan. And what happened with him in the beginning was that he was cast out of heaven because of his rebellion, because of his sin. Over in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 8, John says there, the one who practices sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. And the Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. We're going to talk about that more when we look at the future of the devil. But notice that phrase there in this verse. The devil has sinned from the beginning. That he was created, but he rebelled against God. He would not submit to God. Over in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4, it says that God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. So you have the devil here. You have angels that were cast out of heaven. Evidently, the devil, Satan here, was the one who was leading this rebellion. And that's alluded to in our text over in Revelation 12 and verse 9. That you have the devil and the angels, that they were cast out, they were cast down to the earth. That verse is not talking about what happened in the past, because it's talking about those who overcame them by the blood of the Lamb. So this is talking about something that came once Christ had been crucified. He shed his blood on the cross, but it is at least alluding to what happened before. That's what presented, or that's what gave the image that is being used here, that they were thrown down out of heaven. And the devil first was introduced in the Bible back in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3, a passage that we are familiar with. That in that passage you have the devil in the form of the serpent. Again, in our text in Revelation 12 and verse 9, it talks about the serpent of old. That's referring to Genesis chapter 3. The serpent came, that was the devil, it was Satan. He tempted Eve. Eve saw the fruit of the tree that God said, you shall not eat of this tree. And the devil said, well, you will not surely die, even though God said they would. But he sowed that seed of doubt and led her to believe that she would be like God if she ate of this tree. So she ate, she gave to her husband, he ate. Sin was introduced into the world through the temptation that was brought about by the serpent of old, or the devil, or Satan, as Revelation 12 and verse 9 ties all of them together. That is the same entity, or the same being. So we have this is where the devil came from. He is a created being. He's a real being. He rebelled against God. He sinned from the beginning. And he introduced sin into this world by tempting Eve and led her into sin. But notice some of the ways that Satan is described in the scriptures. We already read Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9, where he's described there as the great dragon. The symbolic or figurative language that's used in the book of Revelation, described there as a great dragon. The serpent of old, as we see there in Genesis chapter 3. And the devil and Satan is the name that we refer to him as. He's also called in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 3 as the tempter. This is when Jesus went into the wilderness and was tempted by the devil. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 3 says, the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. He was tempting Jesus to sin. He's described as the tempter because that's what he was doing. Well, he tempts us to sin. He was trying to get Jesus to sin in the same way he tries to get us to sin. He's described in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 19 as the evil one. In the parable there, Jesus said in Matthew 13:19 that when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom the seed was sown beside the road. As he's explaining the parable of the sower, you have the seed that falls on the roadside, and the birds of the air come and eat it up. It does not get into the soil. It does not produce any growth or any fruit. The evil one is one who does this. Well, this is the devil. He's described as evil because he opposes what is good. He is described by Jesus in John chapter 8 and verse 44 as the father of lies. John 8 verse 44 says there, "You are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So not only does Jesus say he is the father of lies, but he says he was a murderer. He is a deceiver. He is a destroyer. He was the one who introduced sin into the world by tempting Eve, and death came into the world from that. That's why he's described as a murderer. He deceived them. He destroyed them. He is described by Jesus in John chapter 12 and verse 31 as the ruler of this world. John 12:31 says, "Now judgment is upon the world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out." We'll talk about this again when we look at the future of Satan. But he's described here as the ruler of this world. All those who will not submit to God, they are under his power. Whether they acknowledge that or not, because Satan doesn't care if we are actively worshiping him or serving him. What he's trying to do is simply get us to not serve God. We'll see that here in just a minute. But he's just trying to get us to not serve God. So if we are not submitting ourselves to God, whether we acknowledge the devil or not, or pledge our allegiance to him or not, we're under his power if we do not submit to God. He is the ruler of this world. He's described in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4 as the God of this world, which is making the same point as what Jesus made in John 12 and verse 31. It's just worded a little bit differently. But he's described there as the God of this world. He is the one that people are following, that they are submitting to when they do not submit to the Lord. Again, whether they consciously do this or not, that is what is going on. And then in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, he's described in this passage as the adversary. 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour." He is your adversary. He stands opposed to you. If you are among the people of God, he is opposed to you. And so he is described as an adversary. He is like a lion who is seeking someone to devour. He is seeking his prey. He stands opposed to the people of God. All of these descriptions here give us a picture about what he is doing. He is tempting us to sin. He is deceiving us so that we do not believe the truth. He is destroying us by sending us down the path of destruction away from God. He is opposing the people of God. He wants us to turn away from God. He wants to drive a wedge between us and the Lord. This is what he is doing. So when we think about the descriptions of Satan that are given in the Word of God, those descriptions help give us a picture about what he is doing. Next, in the next lesson, we're going to talk more about his work and see what he is doing and why he is doing it. But these show us, at least we get a picture right now, what he is doing. But before we end this lesson here today, the first part of this lesson, I want to talk about the limits of Satan, because this is important. We're going to talk about the work of Satan and why he is so dangerous, why we need to be on our guard against him. But we do also need to take at least a bit of encouragement in the fact that he is limited. Satan is not equal with God. He is not on the same level as God is. John wrote over in 1 John 4 and verse 4, he says, "You are from God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world." Greater is God in you than Satan, who is the god of this world. God is all-powerful. There is no one that can stand up to him, no one who can oppose him. That verse over in Job chapter 42 and verse 2 says there, "I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." This is talking to God. God, he is going to accomplish what he sets out to accomplish, what he intends to do. Nothing that he has purposed to do can be stopped, because he is all powerful. Satan is not. Satan is not like God in that regard. Satan cannot tempt anyone against God's will. We have there in the book of Job where Satan had to come to God and ask permission. The verse on the screen I just noticed is incorrect. It should be Job 1 and verse 12 rather than verse 2. But in that verse and also chapter 2 and verse 5, he had to go to God and get permission to tempt Job, because God would not allow him to do that. Satan had to issue this challenge that, well, if you don't bless him, you don't continue to bless him, then he's not going to be faithful to you. And so God gave him permission to tempt him. Over in Luke 22 and verse 31, Jesus told Peter that Satan has asked permission to sift you as wheat. In other words, he's asked permission to tempt you and to try to get you to turn away from me, to abandon your faith, and to turn back to the world. So Satan cannot tempt anyone against God's will. Now, God does allow us to be tempted. And so Satan does tempt us. But even then, he's limited. Notice what Paul said over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. This should be an encouraging verse for us. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. Paul said, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." Every time we are tempted, God says there is a way of escape. We can be assured of that because, as Paul says, God is faithful. He's promised it, so we know that it will be there. So when we think about temptation and what Satan is tempting us to do and what God has allowed him to do, he's allowed him to tempt us, but he's limited in that. He cannot tempt us in such a way where any choice we make would lead to sin. There is always a choice before us where we can do what is right, where we can avoid sin. Satan can't put a situation in front of us where we have no option but to sin. It may be difficult. We may not want to take that way of escape, but the way of escape will be there because God is faithful. So Satan is limited in how he can tempt us. Jesus said over in John chapter 10 and verse 28 that Satan cannot snatch us out of his hand. John 10:28, he says, "I give eternal life to them," to his sheep, as verse 27 says. "I give eternal life to them, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand." Not even the devil. He's not powerful enough to do this. He's not more powerful than the Lord. And so if we are with Christ, in Christ, one of his sheep, no one can snatch us out of his hand. Satan cannot do that. And in fact, over in James 4 and verse 7, it says that if we will resist him, if we will resist the devil, then what he will do, what he will have to do, is flee from us. James 4 verse 7, submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. If we are submitting to God and resisting the devil, not just resisting the devil but then ignoring God, that's not going to work. But if we submit first to God and resist the devil's not going to be able to overcome us because he's been limited in his power. He's not more powerful than God. And if we submit to God and we follow him and are faithful to him and we resist the devil, he will flee from us. And over in Revelation chapter 20, when it describes Satan being punished, when God brings that punishment against him, Satan is powerless to resist that. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 10, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. When that comes, when God casts the devil into that lake of fire, into that punishment for him, he's not going to be able to fight back. He's not going to be able to resist. He's not going to be able to escape that. He's going to be powerless to resist. Earlier in Revelation chapter 20, the limitation of Satan is described as him being bound. Revelation 20 and verse 1, it says, I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan. Again, using those same terms that we saw in Revelation 12 and verse 9. And bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the abyss, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. So again, a lot of imagery here in symbolic language, and we don't have time to get into all of the symbols and everything that is being described here. But the point is, one thing that the principle we can take from this is that not only is Satan inferior to God, because he's not deity, he's not all-powerful, he was created. So he was already inferior to God. But then this passage is describing him as being limited even further, where he is being bound. So there are limitations that were already placed upon him, but now you have even further limits placed upon him. Satan cannot tempt us against God's will, and when he tempts us, there is always going to be a way of escape. He cannot snatch us out of the Lord's hand. He cannot stand when we are submitting to God and we resist him. When his punishment comes, he cannot resist that. He cannot fight back against God. He cannot escape that. He is limited. That's all the time we have for this lesson as far as what we're talking about with Satan. In the next lesson, we're going to continue this. We're going to look at the work of Satan and the future of Satan. And we've alluded to both of those a little bit here in this lesson as we've looked at his origin and descriptions and the limits. But we're going to get into that in more detail in the next lesson about his work and his future. But one of the things we need to understand as we wrap up here for today, understand that Satan is a real being. He's not a myth. He's not the personification of evil. He is a real being and poses a real threat to God's people. He is the adversary. So Peter said, be on guard against him. Be of sober spirit, because he's prowling around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. But at the same time, remember that he is limited. There is always a way of escape when we are tempted. So let's be looking for that way of escape, taking that way of escape when we see it. And when we are tempted, When we have the adversary who is against us and opposing us and trying to drive us away from God, remember what James 4 and verse 7 said. Submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. So we'll continue this next week in the next part of this series. But keep that in mind as we lead up to that next lesson. Let's make sure we're submitting to God, following His will in all things, recognizing that He is all-powerful. He is the one who will judge us, and even the one who will judge and punish the devil. Submit to God. Resist the devil. He will flee from us. So let's make sure in all that we do that we are being faithful to the Lord.